On my wedding day, I woke up completely bald, and my mother-in-law had left a note saying, "Now you have the perfect look, you pathetic fool." I just smiled because the Viper never imagined that my revenge would end up destroying her entire empire of lies. On her wedding day, Natalie opened her eyes and discovered that her entire head was completely shaved, and the only note she found beside her bed read, "Now you have the perfect look, you pathetic fool." She was 26 years old with a smile that could win anyone's trust. Her voice was warm, like that song you hear by accident and can't stop humming. But her life was far from sweet. She had been born in a forgotten neighborhood in Detroit, where houses were more noise than brick and neighbors knew more about shortages than vacations. Her mother, Carol, had been fighting an aggressive illness for 5 years. Natalie cared for her alone while working as a waitress at a cafe where double shifts were more frequent than kind customers. Despite everything, Natalie didn't know envy. She walked with her head held high, even though her shoes had worn out soles. Her greatest luxury was a hardcover notebook where she wrote her dreams. On the first page, she had written, "Marry for true love, not to escape the neighborhood, but to escape fear." She had met Matthew at the Central Library, where she spent some afternoons reading while waiting for her mother to finish chemotherapy treatments at the public hospital. Matthew, with his designer clothes and expensive cologne, sat next to her by chance. He was struck by how such a beautiful woman read criminology books, as if studying how to survive in a world designed to crush her. "That book is pretty dark, isn't it?" he asked her. "Reality is darker than books," she replied without looking up. That was enough. Matthew was impacted by her way of speaking, intrigued by her serenity, her way of not being impressed by anything. In his world, women pretended to be fragile to get attention. Natalie seemed like a rock carved by blows. At first, Natalie was suspicious. Matthew was kind, yes, but too perfect to be real. He invited her out for weeks before she accepted. He didn't present himself as having a luxury car or as heir to a hotel chain. He only said he worked at his mother's company. When Natalie visited his apartment for the first time, she noticed everything. The expensive wine bottles, the sign paintings, the refrigerator full of imported products. "You're not like me," she said quietly. "That doesn't matter," Matthew replied, taking her hand. "I didn't choose where to be born either, but I can choose who I want to be with." And so began the story that seemed taken from a romantic movie. Matthew gradually won Carol's trust. He visited her, brought her medications, even installed an electric generator so they wouldn't suffer from heat when the power went out. The neighbors began to look at her differently, not with pity, but with admiration. The girl from the alley was going to marry a man who seemed to have stepped out of a fashion magazine. When Matthew proposed, it was during a simple dinner with recycled candles and tuna with rice. Natalie didn't cry, just nodded with a mixture of tenderness and distrust. She was grateful for the moment, but something inside her told her that good things in her life always came with hidden conditions. Matthew's family didn't know her officially. He said his mother traveled a lot, that she was focused on her businesses, that she wasn't good with emotional bonds. Natalie wasn't worried until she met her. Isabella had cold eyes, a measured smile, and sweet words that cut more than a razor. She introduced herself with 2 kisses and a venomous comment disguised as a compliment. "So you're Natalie. How thin you are. With a bit more weight, maybe you could look like the girls Matthew used to date." In that instant, Natalie understood something. This woman hadn't come to meet her. She had come to study her, to classify her, to find the flaw that would justify her contempt. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Wellington," Natalie replied. "Matthew has told me little about you, though I think that says quite a lot." Isabella didn't react, just smiled with her lips, not with her eyes. From that day on, visits became tense. Every time Natalie crossed the threshold of that marble mansion, she felt like an intruder. Isabella was the type of woman who placed glasses on the table according to French etiquette, but didn't even know the name of the gardener who had worked there for 10 years. Still, Natalie decided not to distance herself. She thought Matthew's love was stronger than a controlling mother's rejection. He promised to protect her, that nothing and no one could come between them, that it didn't matter what the media said, or appearances, or money. The wedding dress wasn't new. A neighbor lent it. Natalie had it altered and hand-sewed some fabric flowers to cover a stain that was difficult to remove. Carol cried seeing her dressed, with the veil on and her lips painted. It was an intimate, beautiful moment. The women of the family embraced, overcoming sadness with hope. "Don't forget who you are, daughter," Carol said, caressing her face. "You are light. Don't let anyone dim you." The night before the wedding, Matthew insisted she sleep in the hotel suite where the ceremony would take place. He said he wanted her to feel like a queen. Isabella even feigned a smile when handing her the keys. Everything seemed perfect, too perfect. Natalie showered, had a light dinner, wrote in her notebook, and went to bed early. She dreamed that her mother walked without a cane, and that the neighborhood had flowers in the windows. She dreamed of girls running in a plaza without fear. She fell asleep with a smile, clutching her engagement ring. At 7:46 in the morning, she opened her eyes. The first thing she noticed was that the pillow had something stuck to it. When she touched her head, she felt cold, cold directly on her skin. She ran to the bathroom, turned on the light, and looked in the mirror. All her hair had disappeared. Not a single strand remained. Her scalp was completely exposed. There were small marks, as if someone had run a razor while she slept. She stepped back, tripped on the rug, fell sitting. Her breathing accelerated. Her eyes filled with tears. She wanted to scream, but something stopped her. On the nightstand was a folded sheet of paper. She opened it with trembling hands. The paper had expensive perfume, firm, elegant letters, and the message was brief. "Now you have the perfect look, you pathetic fool." No signature was needed. Natalie knew immediately who had written it. Rage rose in her chest like a black tide. Her reflection returned her to a reality she didn't understand. Her wedding was in 4 hours. Outside, the city was waking up, oblivious to the horror that had just occurred in that silent suite. She crawled to the bed with the papers still in her hand. She read it again, twice, 3 times. The words pierced her chest like needles. She couldn't believe someone was capable of so much, not out of hate, but for power, for control, for pleasure. In her mind, the images repeated. Isabella's fake smile, her way of touching her hair during the last dress fitting, the moment she offered her a glass of wine before sleeping. Had she drugged her? Had she paid someone to do this to her while she slept? Nothing made sense, and at the same time, everything fit together. She could hear her heart beating like a drum. Carol was waiting for her. Matthew was waiting for her. The press was ready. The cameras installed. What was she going to do? Leave like this, cancel the wedding, escape. She covered her head with the sheet. Silence enveloped her. Then something unexpected happened. Natalie began to laugh. First it was a muffled, broken laugh. Then it became a cackle. Not from happiness. It was a laugh that was born from a dark place where sadness and fury embrace. A laugh from someone who has hit bottom and discovers that from there, you can only go up. She removed the sheet, returned to the bathroom, looked at herself fixedly in the mirror. She didn't cry. She got closer, studied every line of her face, removed her earrings, washed her face, closed her eyes, and breathed deeply. "Thank you, Isabella," she whispered. "You just gave me the reason I needed to have no mercy." And she smiled, a smile that had no trace of fear. A dangerous smile. The smile of someone who had just died to be reborn stronger. And so ended the morning when Natalie was supposed to get married, not with a ceremony, not with music, but with betrayal. The story was just beginning, and love wouldn't be enough to save anyone. Hashtag the vanishing. The hour of the ceremony arrived, and the flowers began to wither without fulfilling their purpose. The white chairs, perfectly aligned in front of the altar, remained empty on the bride's side. The sun, which at first shone with the promise of an unforgettable day, gradually covered with heavy clouds. The clock struck 12, and the murmur of guests became increasingly uncomfortable. Some checked their phones, others avoided looking at Matthew, who was sweating cold at the altar, trying to maintain composure while wondering why Natalie wasn't answering messages. Isabella walked back and forth, dressed in a white designer ensemble, as if she were the day's protagonist. She feigned nerves, asked organizers if there were any delays. She smiled at the cameras recording the event for a social media channel. But in her eyes, there wasn't a trace of real concern. What if she changed her mind? Asked a woman in whispers. Who knows? Maybe she never was what she seemed, replied another without taking her eyes off the altar. Matthew, with his face distraught, walked to the suite where Natalie had spent the night. He didn't knock on the door, he pushed it hard. The room was in strange order. The bed made, pillows intact, makeup unused. On a chair, carefully folded, the wedding dress, but there was no trace of Natalie. Not her phone, not her purse, not her perfume, nothing. He entered the bathroom. Everything was dry, towels in their place, not a trace. He ran the curtains, searched in drawers, checked under the bed. Nothing. It was as if she had never been there, as if she had been a ghost who only existed during rehearsals. He came out staggering with the wedding dress in his hands. He pressed it against his chest, searching for her scent, her trace, a sign that everything was a misunderstanding, but there was nothing. Where is she? He asked with a broken voice. Isabella approached slowly, feigning anguish. What's wrong? She's not in the room. Maybe she went to look for her mother. Matthew looked at her fixedly. Something in her voice didn't fit. She wasn't surprised. She had no fear, just a slight nuance of annoyance. Did you call anyone? Do you know something I don't? Of course not, she replied, opening her arms. This situation is affecting me as much as you, son. Natalie was special. The word was left him frozen. It hadn't even been 20 minutes since they discovered Natalie wasn't there, and she was already speaking in past tense. Meanwhile, in the neighborhood where Natalie grew up, Carol waited for news from the old living room sofa, surrounded by neighbors who had gathered hoping to see wedding photos on television. But the transmission had been interrupted. Only a brief statement announced technical problems. No one said anything. Carol looked at the empty screen with the same expression of someone who already suspected something wasn't right. The house's landline rang. Everyone held their breath. Yes, Carol said with a trembling voice. Mrs. Carroll, this is Matthew. Silence settled on the other end of the line. Where's my daughter? I don't know. I'm trying to find her. She didn't come to the ceremony. Her room is empty. The dress is here, but she's not. The woman closed her eyes. She didn't cry, just gripped the receiver tightly. On her face was more anguish than surprise, as if something inside her had felt that day wouldn't bring happiness. My daughter isn't one to run away. If she didn't appear, it's because someone didn't let her get there, she said firmly. By nightfall, the news began circulating. Bride disappears before wedding. The mystery of the interrupted ceremony. The fiancé of entrepreneur Matthew Wellington's whereabouts unknown. The scandal gained strength. The wedding became a media case. Afternoon programs discussed theories. Was it abandonment, forced disappearance, or a strategy to attract attention? Isabella offered an impromptu conference in front of the family mansion. She presented herself to cameras with dark glasses and a silk scarf covering her neck. Natalie was like a daughter to me, she said with controlled voice. I always knew she was special, different. Matthew loved her deeply. We're devastated. We just want her to return. Reporters quickly noted there were no tears on her face. Not one. Her voice didn't tremble. Her posture was perfect. She seemed like an actress reading a script. Rumors began to multiply. Some said Natalie had run away with another man. Others assured she had fled upon discovering Matthew was part of a dangerous family. A few whispered she had been silenced, but the truth was hidden, and Natalie gave no signs. Days passed, then weeks. No one saw her. There were no movements in her bank accounts. Her phone remained off. Police opened an investigation, but without evidence, without cameras, without witnesses, everything was filed under the category of voluntary disappearance. Matthew began to decline. He lost weight, stopped attending the company. He locked himself in his apartment. His phone rang all the time, but he rarely answered. He didn't respond to emails or messages. He started drinking alone. He spent nights looking at the dress she never wore, as if that would bring her back. His friends tried to help him. You need to distract yourself, they told him. Maybe she wasn't for you. Life goes on. But he didn't want it to continue because deep down he knew something didn't add up. He knew Natalie. He knew she wouldn't run away like that. Not without saying goodbye, not leaving her sick mother, not without an explanation. One dawn, drunk and desperate, he drove to the neighborhood where she had grown up. He knocked on her house door at 3 a.m. Carol opened. She was in a robe with a pale face. She wasn't surprised to see him. You come to tell me you looked for her and didn't find her. I come to tell you I haven't stopped looking for her, and I don't believe she left of her own will. And I don't believe it either. Do you think your daughter would leave me like that without more? I don't know, Matthew. But I know that if she didn't return, it's because someone doesn't want her to. Matthew lowered his gaze. He felt his world splitting. Carol's words were blades that opened wounds he couldn't close. My daughter loved you. I saw it. But I also know you don't know your mother like I do. Natalie told me. She said there was something dark in that house, that there were things she didn't understand. What things? She never said, just that she didn't trust her. Matthew didn't respond. He left without saying goodbye. Days passed. Natalie's case dissolved amid new headlines. A businessman accused of corruption, a political scandal. The world kept spinning. Isabella, on the other hand, took advantage of the silence. She resumed her public activities, gave interviews where she spoke of resilience, of emotional strength. She offered herself as spokesperson for women who had lost loved ones, donated money to foundations. Her carefully constructed image showed no cracks. But in her room, she kept a small wooden box with a lock of hair and an old photograph inside. In that image, a smiling woman held a baby wrapped in a knitted blanket. The woman wasn't Isabella, and the baby had Matthew's same eyes. 6 months later, Natalie's name remained a whisper in some people's memory. Her mother continued hanging posters on light posts, kept asking neighbors if they had heard anything, but the silence was total. Matthew returned to the company out of obligation. He didn't talk to anyone, just worked. Some days he looked out the window, as if expecting to see her walking down the street with her hair in the wind, and that way of looking without fear. One morning he received an envelope without a sender. Inside was a handwritten note. Truth always finds a way out, even if it has to crawl from the mud. He didn't know if it was a threat or a warning. He kept the note in his desk. For the first time in months, something lit up inside him. Meanwhile, in a distant city, a woman with a shaved head cleaned tables at a nighttime cafe. She wore an old uniform, worn sneakers, and a gaze that no longer cried. In her apron pocket, a hardcover notebook. And on the last page, a sentence written in firm ink. Revenge doesn't always scream. Sometimes it sits, watches, and waits. The ghost bride hadn't disappeared. She was just preparing her return. And no one, not even the woman who had turned her into a shadow, imagined what was coming. Because the withered flowers from that interrupted wedding still had roots. And Natalie hadn't died. She had just become something much stronger, more dangerous, more awake. The story hadn't ended. It hadn't even really begun. #the return. The air smelled of old grease and reheated coffee. The walls were stained with humidity, and the ceiling fan seemed to spin more from inertia than electrical energy. Natalie cleaned the last table of the night at a roadside restaurant on the outskirts of a city where no one asked questions. She wore a dirty apron, a shirt that was too big for her, and jeans she had sewn 3 times. Her hair didn't exist. She had gone months without a single strand on her head, and that didn't bother her. On the contrary, every morning when she looked in the mirror, it reminded her that she was no longer the same. She was called Laura in that place. Everyone believed she came from the north, that she had escaped a violent relationship, that she was looking for a new life. No one inquired beyond that, and that kept her safe. She had a small room in the back of the restaurant, a narrow bed, a dim lamp, a desk where she studied at night, and an old notebook she kept writing in as if each word were part of her plan. She spent her days between dirty dishes and criminal psychology books. She studied online with a fake scholarship she had applied for using a different identity. In her free time, she attended a foundation for women who had been victims of violence. She helped in the kitchen, distributed donated clothes, and sometimes sat to listen to testimonies. She didn't talk much, just observed. Each story was like a mirror, each shared scar a map that pointed her way back to herself. The first time she wrote in her notebook after the wedding was at the bus station, fingers trembling as she decided where to go. She carried no money, no clothes, no documents, just an unbreakable impulse. She knew she couldn't return home, couldn't endanger her mother, and what she had felt that morning in front of the mirror, that cold, calculated rage, that emptiness without tears, wasn't pain, it was something else, it was a promise. 6 months had passed since then. She had created a name, a routine, a refuge. At night, she trained in self-defense with a retired instructor who asked no questions. The gym was improvised, the floor cracked, and the lights flickered. But there Natalie learned to use her body as a tool of control. To hit, to defend herself, to breathe without fear. Each fall was a lesson. Each poorly received blow, a teaching. She hardened inside without losing her essence because she wasn't looking to become someone cruel. She just wanted to be untouchable. One morning, while drinking instant coffee in front of her old laptop, she received a video link from an anonymous account. The title said, Woman of the Year Award, Isabella Wellington. She opened it without hurry. The screen showed her mother-in-law in an elegant auditorium, receiving an award in front of a crowd that applauded standing. Dressed in white with perfect nails, impeccable hair, Isabella smiled as if she had no stains on her soul. A journalist asked what inspired her as a female leader. She responded with a sweet voice. My motor is strong women, like the one who almost became my daughter-in-law. She taught me that even in loss, a woman can rise with dignity. Natalie let out a hollow laugh, clenched her fists. The cynicism of that phrase was too much. The one who almost became my daughter-in-law. As if she were a distant memory. A minor story, as if the humiliation, betrayal, and disappearance had been a simple detail in her rise to the podium. It was perfect for cameras, perfect for business, and profoundly false. It's not enough for you to destroy, Natalie murmured in front of the screen. You also need the world to applaud you for it. She closed the laptop. That night the training was more intense. She hit the punching bag until she broke a knuckle. She didn't stop. She didn't scream, just breathed deeply. The instructor approached, concerned. You have to take care of your body. Uncontrolled rage can hurt you. I know, she replied without looking at him. But physical pain is the only thing that reminds me I'm still here. After showering, she sat in front of her room's mirror. She observed her face. The shapeless eyebrow, skin marked by sun, dark circles from sleepless nights. She wasn't the same. Not anymore, and she didn't want to be. She looked for her razor in the drawer. She ran the blade over her scalp with firm movements. Not out of necessity, by decision, by power, by control. As the last strands fell to the floor, she smiled. Because this time it wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, and the difference was abysmal. When finished, she dressed in comfortable clothes and went down to the dining room where the foundation manager was waiting for her with a bag of donations. Laura, this arrived for you? I don't know. It has no sender, but it comes with this note. She read it calmly. The paper said, What begins with a lie ends with an explosion. It wasn't the first time she received anonymous messages. Since she started looking for information about Isabella on hidden forums, she knew someone else was following her trail. She didn't know if it was enemy or ally, but someone else knew her story, and that was dangerous. She kept the note in her notebook. That night, when everyone slept, she connected to a private network and began tracking Isabella's company movements. She discovered that one of the foundations the woman directed was related to international adoptions. The documents weren't public, but there were patterns, repeated names, suspicious payments. She took note of everything, names, dates, places. Then she closed the computer and went out to the back alley. She looked at the sky. The stars were weak, almost invisible, but they were there. She thought of her mother. Every 2 weeks, she sent a letter without sender using a remote mailbox. She told her about life with another name, said she was okay, not to worry, that soon everything would make sense. She never gave details. Carol only responded with prayers, drawings, or phrases that didn't say much but were enough to fill Natalie's heart with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. One of those letters said, "I keep leaving the light on at night in case you ever decide to come home." Natalie had read it at least 20 times, but it still wasn't time to return. Not with empty hands, not with the wound open, not with the viper still raining. That same week, in a downtown cafe, she heard a conversation between two men. They talked about Matthew. They said he had returned to work, that he was no longer the same, that he walked like a man carrying a weight that couldn't be seen, that he had locked himself within himself since his fiancée disappeared. She didn't react, didn't change expression, but something inside her chest trembled. Not from love, not from nostalgia, from doubt. Was Matthew as innocent as she always thought? Did he really know nothing, or had he played the role of accomplice without getting his hands dirty? She couldn't be sure. Not yet. But increasingly she felt that her return would not only confront her with her enemy, but also confront her with her past, with what she believed, with what she felt, and with who she was. For now, the only clear thing was that Isabella had power, that she used it to silence, and that the mask of philanthropy she showed the world was about to crack. Natalie closed the notebook, lay down without turning off the light. She looked at the ceiling for hours, reviewing her plan over and over. There was no room for error. She couldn't trust anyone, not even her own memories, because sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't what they do to you, but what they make you believe. And she no longer believed in anyone. The next day she began her movement, small, almost invisible, but decisive. Because resurrection doesn't happen with thunder, it happens in silence. And when it arrives, no one is prepared for what comes. #, infiltration. The train arrived in the city at dawn. The sky was covered in gray, and the station smelled of humidity and abandonment. No one recognized her. No one looked at her twice. Natalie descended from the car with a backpack on her shoulder, hair still shaved, face thin, eyes sunken but firm. She carried a new identity, false documents, and a convincing story she had rehearsed until memorizing every detail. Now she was Clara Mendez, age 28. Incomplete studies, no background, work experience, cleaning services. Address, a cheap boarding house on the edge of downtown. She didn't choose to return to seek comfort or reunite with what she had lost. She returned to infiltrate the machinery, the invisible structure that sustained Isabella. She wanted to enter her world, walk through her hallways, breathe the same air, and look from inside at everything hidden behind her speeches as an exemplary woman. She got a job as part of the cleaning crew in one of the central offices of the Wellington Group. She knew exactly how to move, quiet, punctual, efficient. No one asked her anything. She went unnoticed among other workers. She listened, observed, learned. For weeks she cleaned desks without raising suspicion, checked wastebaskets, scanned documents before throwing them away. She knew how to read between lines. One night, while collecting forgotten files, she found a sealed folder with the logo of a foundation called Clear Future. The document title was Transfer Agreement, Confidential File. Nothing seemed unusual until she read carefully the names of miners and destinations, foreign countries, payments made in cash, official seals that didn't match. Her blood froze. She knew what it was to grow up with shortages. She knew what a mother could sacrifice to feed her children. But this was something else. This was disguised trafficking of minors, signed, sealed, and registered as if it were any procedure. Most children came from poor neighborhoods. No one looked for them. No one claimed them. No one had the power to confront the monster. She photocopied what she could and kept copies in her backpack. That night she didn't sleep. She stayed in her room reviewing every line, every name, every signature. They weren't just papers, they were torn stories, lives dismantled with ink and seals. The woman who pretended to donate money to orphanages was the same one who transformed children into products, and everyone applauded her social work. The next day, while cleaning the main office, she encountered an older woman with gray hair and dim eyes. She was organizing some boxes in the archive. She seemed nervous. Natalie noticed how she quickly hid a paper. Can I help you with that? Natalie asked casually. No need, thanks, the woman replied without looking at her. Don't worry. I just wanted to thank you for how you spoke to me the first day. Not everyone is kind here. The woman looked at her sideways, doubting. What's your name? Clara. I'm Elena. I've worked here for 15 years. Before I was at the house, then they transferred me to the offices. The house. Mrs. Isabella's house. Yes. I was a domestic employee before my daughter got sick. Then I asked to be transferred. I couldn't stand staying there anymore. Did something happen? Elena lowered her gaze. Here no one asks, not even when people disappear. Natalie stayed still. Elena noticed the gesture. Did you know that years ago a girl disappeared while working in that same house? She was young, very intelligent. Her name was Dahlia. They said she knew things, that she had seen things she shouldn't have. She disappeared from one day to the next. They said she left with a man, but she wasn't like that. She never left her things, never called again, never said goodbye. No one investigated. Do you think someone's going to investigate that family? Natalie felt a chill. She remembered her own story, how close she had been to becoming another Dahlia. A note, a betrayal, a silence, and nothing more. That same week, during lunch, she heard two executives talking quietly in the common room. They mentioned a millionaire donation that didn't appear in public balances. A transfer made from an account in a tax haven in the name of a medical foundation that had never built anything. Natalie took note. She knew she had to move carefully. It was no longer just revenge, it was survival. She decided to look for answers elsewhere. Someone who knew more, someone who had been close to the family from inside. She remembered a story her mother told her when she was a child. Once, when young, Carol worked cleaning a parish where the Wellington family used to confess. She said the priest was a correct man, discreet, but he knew things. After asking at several churches, she found who she was looking for. He was called Father Benedict. He was an elderly man with a white beard and trembling hands. He tended a small forgotten church in the center. Natalie waited for him to finish officiating Mass to approach. I remember the Wellington family. More than I'd like. I need to know the truth. The priest looked at her in silence for a long time. Then he invited her into his office. Who are you? I'm someone who had a life torn away, one that family took care to destroy. The priest sighed. I was young when I met them. Isabella's father was a powerful man, but it was his daughter who surpassed everyone. She learned quickly that charity gives prestige, but manipulation gives real power. What are they hiding? More than you imagine. False documents, adoptions without consent, covered disappearances. They have contacts in courts, private clinics. Media, they control everything. And Matthew, the priest remained silent. What do you know about him? Natalie, you don't know who you're messing with, daughter. They don't just destroy lives, they bury them. I need to know the truth. All of it. Father Benedict took a wooden box from the shelf. Inside were old photos, letters, and a death certificate. Natalie recognized a face. It was a young woman with dark skin, large eyes, and a simple dress. At the bottom, handwritten, it said Rosario Velasquez. Who is Rosario? She was an employee at Isabella's mansion more than 20 years ago. She died under dubious circumstances. Officially, it was a domestic accident, but there was something more. She had a son who was illegally adopted. The child grew up believing he was part of that family. They raised him as one of their own. He never knew the truth. And Rosario's son? The priest nodded. His name is Matthew. Natalie felt a knot in her stomach. Everything spun in her head. Every gesture of Isabella's, every phrase, every silence, the constant contempt toward humble origins. Now it made sense. She had raised an employee's son as if he were hers, not out of love, but for convenience, for image, for power. Does he know? No. Or at least he didn't know when I found out. If he's discovered it, he hasn't made it public. Why help me now? Because silence is also a form of guilt, and I've already carried too much. Natalie left the church with papers in her backpack, heart racing, rage contained. Matthew hadn't just been a piece in the game. He was another victim like her, like Rosario, like so many others. Back at the boarding house, she locked herself in her room and spread everything on the bed. Documents, photographs, names, dates, connections. The puzzle was beginning to take shape. She knew approaching Matthew was a risk, but it was also necessary. If he wanted the truth, he would have to be ready to receive it. Because some truths don't just hurt, they also destroy everything one believed to know. And what was coming wouldn't leave anyone intact, not even her. Because when you start digging in the mud, you never know what monsters might wake up. And the Wellington families had been sleeping too long. It was time for someone to look it in the eyes, even if the price was the soul, even if there was nothing left to save. Because sometimes justice dresses in shadow and doesn't ask permission to enter, it just knocks and devastates. Hashtag the confrontation. The rain fell hard on the city's rooftops. Building lights flickered in the distance while wind dragged forgotten papers through empty streets. Natalie walked down the sidewalk with her coat, hood up, and headphones off. She wasn't listening to music. She just needed to isolate herself. Each step brought her closer to the moment she had feared and desired at the same time. The reunion. A week had passed since she left the church with evidence in her backpack. The name Rosario Velasquez still vibrated in her mind like an echo that wouldn't fade. Rosario, Matthew's mother. The woman who was buried like an accident and erased from family lineage as if she had never existed. The woman whose son was stolen to transform him into a museum piece. The encounter was casual, or so she thought. She entered the bookstore looking for a new notebook. The old one was full of notes, dates, names, and routes. She had read it so many times the pages were coming loose. Just as she turned toward the central aisle, she saw him. Matthew stood in front of the history section. He wore a dark blue shirt, jeans, and a simple jacket. He had dark circles, shorter hair, hands in his pockets. He seemed thinner, more tired, but he was still him. She froze. Her first impulse was to turn and leave, but she didn't. Something in her chest stopped her. It wasn't nostalgia, it wasn't love. It was the need to know if he had been part of everything, or just another victim. And the only way to find out was to look into his eyes, see his reaction. She walked slowly until she was less than a meter away. "That book is dense," she said, pointing to the tome in his hands. He looked up, distracted. It took him a few seconds to focus on her face. "Do I know you?" "No, but I have good literary taste." Matthew smiled politely. He seemed not to recognize her. She allowed herself a brief pause. The silence between them was charged. Then he spoke more out of courtesy than interest. "You read a lot about history?" "I'm interested in how lies become truths when no one questions them." Matthew frowned, lowered the book. "Was that a criticism of my choice?" "More of a reflection. Sometimes we inherit truths we didn't choose, and when we discover their constructions, it's too late to dismantle them." There was something in her tone that made him uncomfortable, something familiar, but he still couldn't place her. "Do you have a name?" "Clara." "Matthew." He paused. "I know." He narrowed his eyes. Natalie looked at him fixedly. There was no doubt in her voice or gaze. "We've seen each other before. In dreams. The kind that end in nightmares." Before he could say anything more, she smiled coldly and walked away. That night, Natalie wrote only one sentence in her new notebook. "He still doesn't know who he is, but soon he'll understand what he lost." Meanwhile, on the other side of town, a life was extinguished. Maria, her friend at the foundation who helped her track documents and access files no one should see, was found lifeless in an alley. Police classified it as a robbery. Wallet stolen. No witnesses. No one heard anything. Natalie learned about it on the dining room television. She saw the blurry image of the body, covered with a sheet, and felt the world collapse on her again. She couldn't breathe. She locked herself in the bathroom and hit the wall until she hurt herself. Maria wasn't just an ally. She was the only person who knew her true identity, who knew her complete story, who had embraced her when she woke up screaming at night. And now she was dead. The news was brief. A minute of silence at the foundation. Then everything continued. Natalie couldn't continue. She went to the place where they found her. She knelt on the wet ground, touched the blood stain that hadn't been cleaned yet. She said nothing, just closed her eyes. "I promise your death wasn't in vain," she whispered. And then she knew she had to accelerate the plan. She could no longer wait. Days later, she received a call from an unknown number. It was her mother's neighbor. Carol had suffered a respiratory collapse. She was in the hospital, and there was no one who could sign for her. Natalie didn't want to expose herself, knew each step could betray her, but love doesn't always negotiate with fear. She took the first bus and arrived at the hospital that same night. Carol was in the observation room, connected to a machine. Her skin pale, hands cold. Seeing her, Natalie felt her courage wasn't enough. She sat beside her, caressed her face, and called her softly. "Mom, I'm here." Carol opened her eyes with effort, recognized her immediately. She smiled weakly. "I knew you were alive." "Yes, and I'll be until you're well." "You don't have to avenge me." "It's not vengeance, Mom. It's justice. And it's not just for you, it's for all of them." The woman took her hand with her last strength. "Don't let hatred change you. Don't become what they are." Natalie didn't respond, just hugged her and silently swore not to stop. Leaving the hospital, she walked aimlessly until her rage found a place to escalate. She saw the Wellington mansion from the hill, lights on, curtains closed. Everything remained the same. Cold, intact, false. That night, Matthew also had his own revelation. While searching for some documents in his mother's office, he found a hidden compartment in the antique desk. Inside, photographs. A smiling woman, dark skin, sad eyes, and a baby in her arms. Matthew felt something break. He looked at her for minutes. He didn't recognize the woman's face, but he did recognize his own eyes in the child. Next to the photos, an envelope with a will dated years earlier, signed by someone he didn't know. The document stated that the child, son of Rosario Velasquez, should be adopted by the Wellington family to protect their reputation. Everything stopped in his mind. He ran to the living room, confronted his mother. Who was Rosario Velasquez? Isabella, surprised, tried to deflect. "Where did you find that?" "Answer me. You don't need to know. I'm her son." Isabella approached with burning eyes. "You should never have been born. Your mother was trash like any other you were going to marry." The slap came without thinking. Matthew stood frozen. His mother looked at him with rage, as if she had finally removed her mask. "You've lied to me my whole life," he said with a broken voice. "I saved you. I gave you a life you didn't deserve, and this is how you repay me." Matthew stepped back. "You didn't save me. You stole me." He left the house with the photograph in his hand. For the first time, he understood what Natalie had felt, what she had lost, what they had taken from both of them. She hadn't just fled. She had survived the same lie that now enveloped him. And now both had a truth that burned, a truth that hurt, a truth that could no longer be hidden. Because when silence breaks, it does so with noise, with tears, with blood. And the price of that truth was just beginning to be collected. Hashtag the alliance. Matthew didn't return to the mansion that night. He drove without a fixed destination. His face still burned from the slap. But what really hurt was the other thing, the invisible part, what couldn't be explained with a mirror or ice. His entire life felt like an elegantly told lie, a story built on a false foundation that now creaked from underground. Rosario Velasquez. That name wouldn't leave him alone. He couldn't stop imagining her. He couldn't stop wondering how all traces of her were erased, how he grew up believing he was part of a family that had actually used him as another accessory. At dawn, he parked the car in front of a gray building on the periphery. He climbed the stairs to the third floor. He knocked on the door decisively. "Clara, open up. I know you're there, whether Natalie or whatever you call yourself now." The door opened slowly. Natalie looked at him with a dry face, no makeup, no expression. She wore an old t-shirt and her hair was still shaved. She had nothing left to hide. "So, you already know," she said without emotion. "I know some things, not everything. And you've come for the rest. I've come because I'm tired of living in a stage set by others. I need to know what was true in my life and what was just props." Natalie let him pass. She closed the door softly, offered him cold coffee she had prepared hours before. They both sat face to face. There was tension in the air, but also something different. Not reconciliation, not tenderness. Something else, forced complicity through pain. Your mother didn't just build an empire with lies, she began. She sustained it with bodies, with silences, with people who disappeared so others could pretend a perfect life. She showed him the documents, recordings, photographs, contracts with judges' signatures, doctors, orphanage directors, hidden payments, funds diverted from foundations to foreign accounts. Everything was organized, classified, impossible to deny. You got all this alone. I had help, people who are no longer here. Some were bought, others were erased. Matthew swallowed hard. Natalie looked at him calmly. She wasn't seeking his approval, just that he understand, that he comprehend the scope. There are ministers' names here, he said. If this comes to light, it's going to blow everything apart. That's what I want. Not for revenge, for all the lives that couldn't speak, for those still keeping quiet. They remained silent for a few seconds until he asked something that had been incubating for days. Do you think I was part of this? Natalie didn't answer immediately. She observed him attentively. No, but you were her shield, her perfect son, her trophy. They loved you for being their property, not for who you really were. And that made you part of their facade. Matthew lowered his gaze. She continued, I don't care if you were naive or complicit. What matters to me now is what you'll do with this. Days passed and they became a team. A broken team, yes, but functional. They reviewed folders, reconstructed timelines, traced links between politicians, private clinics, and foundations with smiling children's faces on their covers. They began contacting former workers. Some didn't answer, others hung up, but one agreed to talk. His name was Adrian. He had worked as a recording technician at the foundation offices. He had videos, recordings of internal meetings, conversations that should never have been registered, but were archived out of routine. When Natalie and Matthew listened to the recordings, they felt nauseated. We can't receive more children from Honduras. The cost of moving them is higher, and we already had a scandal there, said a shameless male voice. And the babies from Rosario's clinic? We already have 3 families waiting. Assign them and that's it. You know what documents to prepare, another responded. There was laughter, names, dates. Isabella was present at several of those meetings. Her voice appeared firm and elegant, talking about accounting adjustments, public image, how to continue generating positive impact for the community. Natalie felt disgust. Matthew covered his face with both hands. How many lives are behind this voice? He asked. There was no answer. They began filtering information anonymously to independent journalists, activists, social media accounts specialized in denouncing corruption. Headlines exploded. The dark side of philanthropy. Child trafficking network linked to high-level figures. Leaked documents revealed judicial and medical corruption in illegal adoptions. Charitable foundations covered money laundering and newborn disappearances. Isabella began losing control. At first, she denied everything. She published official statements, declarations prepared by her legal team, appeared in interviews swearing she had no relation to those documents, that everything was part of a campaign against her. But the files kept coming out one after another. Then she made another decision, a desperate one. She sent men to look for Natalie. Not lawyers, men. It was a Thursday. Natalie was walking down the street with a folder of information to deliver to a reporter. A black van stopped beside her. 2 men got out. One grabbed her arm. The other whispered in her ear not to scream. She didn't scream. She fought. She remembered every lesson learned, every blow practiced in that forgotten gym. She used her elbow, her knee, her rage. She bit, hit, ran, managed to escape, took refuge in a store, locked herself in the bathroom, called Matthew. Her voice trembled, but didn't break. They tried to take me. We've crossed the line. There's no going back. Matthew went to find her. They spent the night in a hotel room with windows closed and phones off. If they don't kill us, he said, this is going to make history. I prefer that to dying being part of the silence. The next day, the scandal reached a new level. Audio was leaked where Isabella spoke directly with the judge. They negotiated sentences, exchanged favors. The press poured over the mansion. Helicopters, cameras, journalists at the gate. Isabella didn't come out, didn't respond, didn't show her face. That night she locked herself in her room, took pills, wrote a note. But someone found her before she could fulfill her objective. She was taken to the hospital. She barely survived. The news ran through all channels. Isabella Wellington attempts suicide amid corruption scandal. The image of the powerful, impeccable, invincible woman crumbled. When police arrived at her house, they found her in a nightgown, makeup running, absent gaze. They handcuffed her in front of cameras, put her in a patrol car. The entire country saw her fall. Matthew watched the transmission from a cafe's dining room. Natalie was beside him. They didn't toast, didn't embrace, didn't celebrate. "Do you feel better?" he asked. "No, because it's not about me. It's about what was done, what was allowed, what no one questioned. And now we have to continue." She stood up, left an envelope on the table. Inside were more documents, more names, more stories. It wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of reconstruction. Because when an empire of lies crumbles, the dust doesn't settle immediately. It covers everything, stains everything, and only afterward, when it dissipates, can you see what really remained standing. And among those ruins, Natalie wasn't seeking revenge. She was seeking dignity, justice, and truth, even if it hurt, even if it killed, even if no one was left to celebrate it. Because there are victories that don't bring applause, only silence and peace. Finally, peace. #hashtag justice. The case had exploded like a time bomb. Media continued transmitting fragments of recordings. Some still tried to protect those involved. Others, braver, demanded complete justice. Several judges resigned. Some doctors disappeared. Linked foundations were closed, their accounts frozen. There were open investigations in 3 countries. But within all that chaos, she was no longer at the center. She withdrew without noise. She delivered everything she had, didn't seek recognition, only truth and an exit door. Isabella was convicted, not for everything she had done. Justice rarely reaches all corners, but it was enough. Influence trafficking, criminal association, manipulation of official documents. The sentence confined her to a high-security women's penitentiary, a solitary cell, a metal bed, no mirror. Natalie didn't go to see her. She didn't need to. She no longer felt hatred. She felt something else, something deeper, detachment. She no longer wished for her to suffer. She wished for her never to have power again, for the world to forget her. And that's what happened. Months passed, cameras disappeared, news changed focus, new scandals occupied headlines. Isabella's figure dissolved like ink in water. Matthew never entered that house again. He sold the property and donated part of the money to an organization he founded with Natalie. They named it in honor of a woman almost no one remembered, Rosario. The Rosario Foundation, a refuge, a network of legal, psychological, and medical help for women who had been silenced. Volunteers worked there, therapists and former employees of fraudulent foundations who now wanted to amend their past. Natalie didn't assume any executive position. She stayed in the shadows answering calls, writing reports, organizing workshops. She knew her face was still recognizable. Some called her the disappeared bride, others the voice that changed the system, but she never wanted fame. Only truth. Carol, her mother, spent her last months in a private clinic with a window facing the garden. Natalie went every morning. She brought books, sweet bread, and an old radio playing boleros. The illness advanced relentlessly. There was no cure, but there was dignity, and she cared for that with everything. One afternoon, while sun entered through the window and gardenia perfume floated in the air, Carol looked into her eyes with that tenderness only mothers know how to transmit. She caressed her cheek slowly. "You became a real woman. I learned it from you. Don't forget who you are, even if the world tells you otherwise. I never will." That night, Carol closed her eyes with a smile. There were no screams, no emergencies, just calm, as if she had waited for that moment to leave, peacefully. The funeral was intimate. A few people, some flowers, no photographers. After burial, Natalie walked alone to the old house where she grew up. The facade remained the same, peeling walls, rusty gate, but something inside had changed. She sat on the entrance step, listened to children's laughter playing in the street with an old ball. One approached and showed her a doll without hair. She took it carefully, caressed it tenderly. "What's her name?" "She has no name," the girl replied. "But I don't care. She's brave." Natalie smiled. "Yes, sometimes having nothing makes you have everything." She returned the doll, stood up, kept walking. Neighborhood people greeted her without words, just with their gaze. They knew who she was, knew what she had done, and that was enough. Days later, she was invited to speak at a human rights forum. She didn't want to. She wasn't interested in talking about her story, but something inside pushed her. She went up on stage dressed in black, no ornaments, no makeup. The auditorium was full. There were cameras, absolute silence. She approached the microphone, looked at the audience, didn't read anything, spoke from within. "I didn't cut my hair. I cut my fear." A murmur crossed the room. No one dared interrupt her. "I learned that pain isn't eliminated with justice, but it is ordered. I learned that silence can be as cruel as a blow, that doing nothing is also a choice, and that if we don't speak, they bury us with the truths we keep quiet." Someone cried in the last row. This isn't a revenge story. It's a story of limits and what happens when we cross our own to protect what we still love. Sometimes that means losing everything, but there are losses that save you and truths that hurt more than any punishment. She paused, looked at an older woman in the audience. She had her hands interlaced, crying silently. "I didn't look for heroes. I'm not one. I just did what had to be done. And if that changed something, then it was worth it." The audience stood up. The ovation was long, deep. She left the stage without looking back. That night she wrote in her notebook for the last time, "I didn't win. I just decided not to lose myself." Closing the notebook, she knew there was nothing more to say. She had told the truth, done justice, said goodbye to her mother, and returned to look the world in the face without trembling. Walking down the street back home, she saw a woman stop in front of a newly painted mural. It was a portrait of Rosario. Below, a phrase, "Truth doesn't die, it just waits." Natalie stopped beside her. The woman looked at her, said nothing, just nodded. Sometimes the deepest recognition is what isn't said. Natalie's story didn't fill headlines for long. The country changed scandals. Networks forgot. But in shelters, courtrooms, silent neighborhoods where people still fear to speak, her name kept floating. Not as a symbol, as an example. Because revenge can destroy, but truth liberates. And in a world full of masks, silence also screams. When you hear it, you can no longer ignore it. You only have to choose. Stay quiet or wake up. She chose to wake up and never slept again. ##epilogue. There are many people going through similar situations. We hope her voice lives in you. Share this story and be part of change. If this story has moved you, I invite you to leave in comments what you felt reading it. And if you've been through a similar situation of betrayal, I'd love for you to share your valuable opinion. Remember to tell me from what city you're reading this story. I'd feel honored if you like it. Share it with a friend or family member. And remember that truth, no matter how buried, always finds its way to light. We have guaranteed entertainment exclusively for you. The fight for justice never ends, and sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply refusing to stay silent.